Hello, my fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you one more time to discuss a topical issue. Now, one of the things that I have been passionate about is the whole matter of education, because I am an educator and I consider it a privilege to be one, because educators are the people who educate generations upon generations to take up, very important roles in our societies, right? So it is very, very critical that we have excellent educators in the world. Now, I've always been concerned about education because I think that there is a distinct difference between education and training. And so much of what, universities and schools do nowadays is centered around training and not education. And, we can also talk about indoctrination, which we have to talk about in a separate video, because I think that our institutions of higher learning, particularly, are centered also on the whole notion of indoctrinating students into believing, into accepting a particular narrative. And the university should be a place where people have a certain level, a certain degree of intellectual curiosity, right? That they should be able to question knowledge and to question dogmas and to question discoveries, scientific discoveries, things that we say are facts. Because a lot of times what we think are facts today might be things that are falsehoods tomorrow. So we have to be very careful when we say that things are facts. Of course, we have some established facts, but even those two, when we are in an environment that should be demonstrating intellectual curiosity, those established facts or some of those established facts can be challenged. And that is the purpose of a university. Now, in the media in recent times, we have been seeing a lot of things about the Ivy League schools, in particularly Harvard and Yale and MIT and the University of Pennsylvania, right? As regards their understanding of free speech towards Jews. Now, today we're going to be looking at an article that was written in the Guardian newspaper, that's the UK Guardian newspaper. And this article was published on, the 18th of August, 2022. And the title of the article is US Universities Are Pipelines to the Defense Industry. What does that say about our morals? And that the author's name is Indigo Olivier. And he says here, much of our higher education system is a glorified feeder for Lockheed Martin and other defense industry firms. Now, this is very interesting, right? But let us continue in the article, right? Because we don't want to spend a long time on this article. In his 1961 farewell address, Dwight D. Eisenhower warned the nation against the unwarranted influence of the military-industrial complex. But a lesser-known part of the speech was addressed to universities, which might have been taken out of his speech. In the same fashion, the Free University, historically, the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. This is interesting, that a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. It means, therefore, that professors are beholden to accepting the narrative of the government or the military-industrial complex, right, whom the government actually represents. right? So we didn't listen, this author is saying. For the better part of the pandemic, I have been researching the defense industry's ties to college campuses as part of an investigative fellowship for the magazine In These Times. On the 11th of August, we published a 4,300-word feature article on Lockheed Martin's sweeping recruitment on college campuses. So here we have military organizations, right? These industries that sell weapons, among other military gears, right? And they are the ones who are recruiting professors and students, right? And ensuring that they provide funding for research. But a lot of time, those research tend to be, tainted, right? Because the fact of the matter is that the research is not going to do anything that challenges the narrative of the government. You must understand that the military and the government are one, right? So they're not separate in terms of the fact that, you can have an independent military of what happens in Congress, right? Because they work in tandem, right? It's the military industrial complex that runs the show in Washington. We found an environment in which STEM students are funneled into the defense industry through recruitment, research, financial assistance, or some combination of the three. I've always thought about this emphasis on the STEM subjects, and we are, placing lesser degree of attention on the humanities. So it's almost like we're losing our humanity, and we tend to put science on a pedestal. And when I say science, I'm not using the word in general. I'm using natural sciences on the pedestal, right? And science, as we know, and I know, does have its place, but we cannot put the humanities, we cannot put science rather over the humanities, because we're humans first, right? And then we can begin to explore the universe or the environment in which we live, right? So we need to understand that. And many of us do not understand the history, right? And the importance of reading. And that is why so many people are caught up within the status quo, right? They do what their governments tell them to do because they do not have the mind to think, right? And there is a different way of thinking when you pursue languages and history and philosophy than when you pursue science, right? It's two different levels of thinking. And some of us have not yet developed the ability to read a document and to be able to have to exhibit or to demonstrate some amount of intellectual curiosity by asking hard questions, not believing everything that you see. Now, Lockheed offers cash prize competitions, scholarships, and paid internships to students, which have served as pipelines to employment. In 2020, the company hired 2,600 interns and claimed over 60% of graduating former interns converted to full-time jobs. So this is attractive for students leaving university. And who will not do this? Because in the first place, many students have, huge students loan that they have to pay back, right? So they're not going to question the narrative, and they're not going to put their future in peril by not taking these jobs and by not doing what they're told, right? Because when you have thousands of dollars in debt, then you think that this is going to be a definite blessing for you to be engaged in such a work, even though it might go against some of your morals, even though it might go against some of your ethics, right? And these military companies are not ethical in no sense of the word, right? And this is something that should be understood. On campus, Lockheed has set up recruiting tables in the lobbies and hallways of student buildings and hosts workshops on everything from space exploration to resume building. At the University of Texas at Arlington, A $1.5 million donation resulted in one of their buildings being renamed the Lockheed Martin Career Development Center. So this is what is happening in the United States as we speak. That the military-industrial complex has this inordinate amount of influence on these academic centers of learning, right? I call them academic centers of indoctrination, because what they're doing is militarizing the campuses of the United States. So what you have is that students are going to believe that all the wars should be fought, all the wars should be waged, because the United States is protecting the world. And there's no way that they are going to go against the full spectrum dominance that the United States is propagating around the world. But the company's signature recruiting event, which is hosted at more than a dozen universities, is something called Lockheed Martin Day. Recruiters attract students with virtual reality demos, flight simulators, and in some cases, landing their helicopters directly on campus. Company officials have been known to offer on-the-spot job and internship opportunities to students during the event. Additionally, Lockheed has poured resources into the financial support and recruitment of students at historically Black colleges and universities. That's the HBCUs, earning its place as the #1 industry supporter of HBCU engineering institutions for 7 years in a row, right? So no university is spared, right, from their propaganda, right? Because this is propaganda at its best, at its finest. And we have many of our students in universities unaware of the dangers of the military-industrial complex, right? Because the universities are not, for the most part, unless you study history and you're in the humanities, are not going to sensitize you to an awareness, to an understanding. And that is the reason that the humanities are not given much attention at these universities. In fact, when I was, in university, people would ask me the question, what are you going to do with your degree? I was studying Spanish, because to them, Spanish is nothing, right? Because it's just studying some words, right? Not understanding that you have to understand the histories and the cultures, right? The religions, right? The economies of these countries that speak the language, over 27 countries that speak the language. And that is going to give you information to which you would not have been privy had you not studied that particular language. And the realities that are in these countries. And in many cases, you're going to see how the US and its military interests are tied up in these countries, right? And so one of the things when you see these patterns and how they shaped these countries in these, third world, in the global south, you're going to understand the agenda of the military-industrial complex. And the US does not want many of its citizens to be sensitized to those realities. Now, when Black women hold the highest average student loan debt, that's they're saying that Black women hold the highest student loan debt, and that is $41,466. It's hard to argue against additional financial support, no matter where it comes from. And I did say that before, that because many students have these astronomical debt to pay back, they are not going to be thinking about ethical norms, right? They will accept the job. And, many of us who are vain, we like to be in big jobs that we are earning lots of money, and we like to flaunt that we're working for such company, not understanding that these companies are also killing and maiming hundreds of thousands of citizens around the world. Unless you start with a more basic question, why do Black women graduate with the largest debt burden? Why are HBCU endowments, on average, 70% smaller than other universities? 70%. That is a huge number. And I'm sure that is a deliberate effort to keep Black people in debt, right? And so that we could also be, like slaves, be beholden to the military industrial complex. Why is 1.7 trillion for Lockheed's that is F-35 fighter jet considered a worthwhile investment, but 1.7 trillion in student debt relief considered a handout? And that's a very good question, right? Because sometimes when people think that when the US helps minorities, they'll say that these people want free cake, right? And they want freeness. And they're not thinking that the military industrial complex, right, also get a lot of free cake, right? And nobody complains. And I would argue that an education is perhaps, of definitely better than investing in a military that is going to kill people around the world. Now, there is a difference between military and militarism, and you've got to understand that difference. So having a military is necessary for self-defense of any country, right? But it's when you now begin to use the military and to exalt it as a god and to keep it in this, to invest more in that military than you invest in the people of that country. Then you call that militarism. It's almost like it's a religion, that you place more emphasis on wars than on peace and on building the infrastructure and the human resources of your country. And that is what the United States is doing at the moment and has been doing for decades, right? And it's time for us to wake up and understand that. The answer boils down to what priorities we set as a nation and the investments we are willing to make based on these priorities or those priorities. Last year, the Biden administration, that's the Biden-Harris administration, announced an unprecedented $5.8 billion investment for HBCUs. And on the surface, it looks good. And many people welcome these funds. But we must always ask ourselves the question, where are these funds coming from? What are the strings attached to these funds? Right? Oftentimes people tell me that, oh yes, we have a journal and you need to read that scholarly journal, right? And I've always asked them, who is funding that journal, right? Because they also have their strings attached. And it doesn't matter if it's a scholarly journal, because scholars are also stupid and scholars also have to follow the narrative, right? They shouldn't, but that is the world we live in, where being a scholar does not necessarily mean that you are, you're ethical, you're morally ethical person, or you are emphasizing the truth, or you possess intellectual curiosity. We've got to understand these things. And many people are still thinking and still viewing the university as places of, learning, of advanced learning that develops critical thinking. But for a number of years, that has not been the case, longer than we can even imagine. Now, by comparison, the administrator has sent nearly twice that figure in military assistance to Ukraine. Now, the writer goes on, and talks about the fact that this country, referring to the United States, reached a grim milestone in 2020. For the first time, government funding to Lockheed Martin extended funding to the Department of Education. Exceeded. It's not sorry. It's not even that. Let me repeat that because I messed up this word. This country reached a grim milestone in 2020. For the first time, government funding to Lockheed Martin exceeded funding to the Department of Education. Right? So the United States is investing more in the military than in education. It should tell you where that nation is heading. When a nation spends more on a single military contractor than the agency tasked with overseeing college financial assistance, Lockheed scholarships seem less like an act of charity and more like intentional policy choices, right? So when they're giving you all of these niceties, right, and they claim that they are also charitable organizations, where are they getting the money from? From the government, from taxpayers. So in other words, you're paying them back to be charitable to you. You're paying them, you're investing in them so that they can be charitable to you, which really doesn't make any sense, but that's what it's all about. And we've got to be careful sometimes when we see gifts coming to us, because sometimes the bearer of those gifts can be dangerous, okay? Now, while Lockheed's presence on college campuses goes back decades, its scholarship program was only launched in 2019. Following Donald Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, Lockheed made a commitment to invest $50 million in STEM education enrichment programs and the STEM scholarship program over the next 5 years. So they're getting their money and their funding from US taxpayers. And it's important for us to understand that. All right. Now, I'll acknowledge that these policies have resulted in a complicated reality. Millions of people around the world, including students, now depend on exorbitant defense spending. Right? So students are now getting their educational funding from the Defense Department. Right? Now, that is interesting. Right? And I did produce a video about the militarization of education over college campuses, and you need to go and watch that video, right? Because you will understand that the universities in the United States specifically, and perhaps around the world, are just mere centers of military indoctrination, right? Where they are desirous of indoctrinating into the militarized world in which we currently reside in. Now, according to a 2001 Bloomberg report, nearly every U.S. state has economic ties to the F-35, with 29 states counting on the project for 100 million or more in economic activity. This is how the military-industrial complex, even though you might think, yeah, it has its flaws, but it also helps in the economy, right? And this is where now the politicians are silent, because it helps them to, to regain their positions and to be able to do things for their constituents, right? So this is what is happening, and we must take stock. Lockheed's presence on college campuses poses a question, or this question to us, and underscores two competing visions for the university, a political and economic tool in service of the world as it is, or an institution dedicated to advancing critical thinking and civic engagement for the world as it could be. I don't think university, as we see it today, is geared towards developing critical awareness and critical thinking. It cannot be. right? Because it's tied, for the most part, to the Defense Department, to the Pentagon, right? And when we think about these things, it's sometimes very difficult to digest, right? It's very difficult to understand that we're paying huge sums of money, so many of us in debt, right, to receive an education that is rooted and grounded in all the, you know, purposes of indoctrination, right? And it is now time for us to make a very important decision, whether or not we're going to, you know, inherit great amount of debt for a tool of indoctrination, right? I think we've got to sit down carefully and begin to reflect, right? And it has to be a deliberate attempt that Black people in the United States are the ones who have inherited great amounts of debt, particularly Black females, right? And the fact that the US continues to invest so much money, billions of dollars every year, into growing this military industrial complex at the expense of educating its citizens. It's time for us to wake up and to understand that education, as we think it should be, is not. Thank you so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you in another video. Thank you. Bye.